personal jurisdiction in civil procedure really boils down to, let's just say you get sued, okay? If you get sued by another person, that person must establish that that court has jurisdiction over you, okay? It must be proven. So you just can't randomly get hauled into court, right? So there's a process that has to be made in order for you to get sued in whatever jurisdiction that person is wanting to sue you in, okay? So let's go through PJ, and I will explain exactly on whether or not a jurisdiction would have jurisdiction over you in order for you to get sued. So this is our outline. We have the general definition of personal jurisdiction. We have our historical basis, Pennoyer v. NEFF. We have our state long-arm statute, international shoe, and then we can conclude. So the general definition of personal jurisdiction is when a court has jurisdiction over a person in an action by the plaintiff against the defendant. Okay? The Latin phrase of this is in personam, is when the court is suing a person. The historical basis of Pennoyer v. NEFF is still mentioned up until this day. This is a very old case that really established presence and consent. So at that time, courts could have jurisdiction over a person if presence or consent is established. So what does presence and consent really mean? So presence is when the defendant is physically present in the state forum, okay, or domiciled in that forum. So let's just say that I live in Minnesota. Let's say I moved back. Let's say I live in Minnesota. I'm physically in Minnesota. Okay, that will cut it. Another thing that will be established is if I'm domiciled in Minnesota. Domiciliary really boils down to two things, two elements to that. Is I reside in Minnesota and I have the intent to remain in Minnesota or the intent to return to Minnesota. Okay, right now I live in California. I reside in California. Okay, technically speaking, I may not be domiciled here because if I want to move back to Minnesota, I technically will be domiciled in Minnesota still because I have the intent to go back to Minnesota, although I reside in California. Okay, so I must live in that state forum where that person wants to sue me in, and I also must have the intent to remain in that state where that person wants to sue me. Then I can properly have jurisdiction in that state and I can get hauled into court by whomever wants to sue me. Okay, consent is really two things. It could be either implied consent or express consent. Implied consent is when the defendant voluntarily steps into the foot in the forum state. Okay, let's say I want to drive to Nevada to see family. Okay, the moment I touch Nevada's border, that is implied consent. And if I get into a car crash at the border of Nevada, I can get sued there because I voluntarily went into their boundaries. Okay? Express consent. Express consent is really when the defendant does not object to the court's jurisdiction. Okay, so let's just say that my buddy Riley wants to sue me in Minnesota. Okay, he sends me the subpoena and I see it. And I voluntarily go to Minnesota, I go in court and I fight the case. That is express consent. If I object to it and I want to fight the case against the court having personal jurisdiction over me, that will not be express consent because I am objecting. But if I do not object and I fight the case, that will be me having express consent for Minnesota to have jurisdiction over me, although I reside in a different state forum. So the state long-arm statute boils down to this definition. So the state long-arm statute is when the court grabs the defendant from another state forum in order to exercise PJ over him or her. In the state of California, as long as it is constitutional, this rule will be satisfied. So the constitutionality of the state long-arm statute is really the due process clause. So there must be sufficient minimum contacts in fair play and substantial justice. Okay, which really means that the defendant must have some type of contact with that state forum, and it must also follow the due process clause, which is fair play and substantial justice. So International Shoe is the landmark case that actually established the sufficient minimum contacts test and also the constitutionality of the court exercising PJ over a defendant, which is fair play and substantial justice. So the exercise of PJ over the defendant cannot offend the traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice. And our small outline here in regards to that is shown right here in these subpoints, which is minimum contacts must be established. We need purposeful availment, foreseeability, stream of commerce plus, as if you're a corporation that's selling products to the stream of commerce in a state forum. We need relatedness, and then we get into due process clause, fair play, and substantial justice. Minimum contacts. So minimum contacts really boils down to this, that the defendant must have sufficient minimum contacts with the state forum. An example of this is, let's say Sammy, who lives in state A, mails an Xbox One to Riley, who lives in state B. I voluntarily made a contact with state B because I intentionally and voluntarily mailed the Xbox to Riley, who lives in state B. Therefore, example, let's say that the Xbox One explodes in Riley's face. That will be a cause of action that Riley could use in order to say that, hey, he mailed it to me. He voluntarily sent it from state A to B. Therefore, he has sufficient contacts, and those contacts that Sammy has with state B is related to my harm. Therefore, the jurisdiction in state B will suffice here, and I will haul him into court in state B. Another example, because things are getting very political, Donald Trump, who resides in Washington, D.C., gets into a car crash with Barack Obama, who resides in Washington, D.C. Just an example. So because they are in the same forum, this will cut it, because Donald Trump has continuous and systematic contacts with the forum because he resides there. He's domiciled there. He has the intent to remain there, assuming he wins the election. And Obama lives there, because it's just an example. Say Obama resides there, he has the intent to remain or return, and he's domiciled in Washington, D.C. as well. So because they are both in the same forum, and because the crash happened in the same forum, either one of them can sue each other, and the lawsuit will happen in D.C. Purposeful availment. Purposeful availment is very straightforward. Probably the easiest element in the whole presentation here is that when the defendant intentionally makes a contact with the state forum, the contact that the defendant makes with the state forum cannot be incidental. Okay, so basically, whoever wants to get sued, let's say in Nevada, has to voluntarily make a contact with Nevada. It can't be incidental. If it's proven that it's incidental contacts, then that's not enough. Then the court cannot exercise PJ over the defendant. Okay, we have two straightforward examples here. Example one, Raymond, who resides in California, buys a PlayStation 5 on Amazon that is incorporated in Washington State. Amazon then voluntarily sends the PlayStation 5 to his residence. Okay, so this example would cut it. It would be purposeful availment because Amazon voluntarily and intentionally sent a PlayStation 5 to Raymond's residence in the state of California. Therefore, that will cut it for not only purposeful availment, but also sufficient minimum contacts because Amazon voluntarily made a contact with that state forum. Sufficient contacts, and we have the intent there because Amazon made that deal with Raymond to give him the PS5 for money. Example two, Susie, who resides in Wisconsin, buys protein powder from GNC in Minnesota. Okay, so we have Susie, who's domiciled in Wisconsin, and she drives to Minnesota, goes to a GNC store, and buys protein powder. Okay. Susie then drives from Minnesota to California and shares that protein powder with her friend Kevin. Kevin gets sick. Kevin cannot sue GNC in California. So Kevin would really only have two options here. Okay, he would have to really sue GNC in whatever state GNC is incorporated in. For the sake of this example, let's say GNC is incorporated in Minnesota. Okay, that would be the only option that Kevin can make in order to sue them because GNC did not making intentional contact with Kevin in California. Right? The only reason why he got sick in the first place by GNC's products is because Susie brought the protein from Minnesota to California. Therefore, Kevin would have personal jurisdiction over GNC in Minnesota, not California, because the intent isn't there. Foreseeability. So it must be reasonably foreseeable that the defendant would get sued in that state forum. So an example of this is, say Eric, who resides in Idaho, sells cars for a living. He sells a car to Ash Ketchum in Idaho. Ash resides in Nevada, and Eric knew that Ash would drive the car back home. Ash then drives the car back home, and the car's engine explodes on the highway, due to Eric's negligent repair. It is reasonably foreseeable that Eric would get sued in Nevada because he knew that Ash is domiciled in Nevada, and Eric knew that Ash would drive the car Ash is purchasing from him from Idaho to Nevada. Therefore, because of his knowledge, of him knowing that and selling the car to him, etc., that is why Nevada would have PJ over Eric, and that's why it is foreseeable that Eric would have gotten sued in Nevada. Stream of Commerce Plus. Stream of Commerce Plus really is focused on, more famously, incorporated defendants such as GNC, Apple, Amazon, you name it. Basically, incorporations such as that. And the plus part of it is intent. So the defendant intentionally sold his or her products in a stream of commerce in that state forum. The defendant must have done so intentionally, not voluntarily. So this is kind of related to personal availment, except now we're dealing with products. Example, Snoffic, a CEO of I Love Tires that is incorporated in Delaware, intentionally sells his tires in the stream of commerce in Delaware and California. For the past 10 years, he has made $500,000 through the successful business deals in the forum states. So let's say my buddy Kevin drives his car and one of his tires ends up popping on the freeway. And one of those tires happened to be one of Snoffic's tires that he sold to Kevin in the stream of commerce because, as you can see in the example, Snoffic sells his tires in both Delaware and California. Kevin technically would have PJ over Snoffic because one of Snoffic's products got into the stream of commerce in California intentionally, and Kevin will be able to sue Snoffic for that one reason, that, hey, you sold me a faulty tire, therefore I'm taking your butt to court. Relatedness. So relatedness boils down to two different kinds of jurisdictions here. So if the contacts are continuous and systematic, such that the defendant is at home in a safe forum, there's general jurisdiction, and the plaintiff may sue the defendant for any reason. So just as I said before with the Donald Trump and Barack Obama example before, let's just say that they both get into a bar fight in D.C. They reside in D.C., right? They are domiciled in D.C. And so that means that the contacts are continuous and systematic because they live in that forum. And the occurrence of the fight happened in D.C. Therefore, Donald Trump can sue Barack Obama for any reason, and Barack Obama can sue Donald Trump for any reason. Secondly here, if the contexts are isolated, singular, or random, there is specific jurisdiction, and the plaintiff can only sue the defendant for that specific contact. Okay, so let's skip our first example here with Austin and Israel. Let's go to our second example. So James, who is domiciled in Michigan, sends a Nintendo Switch to Emily, who is domiciled in California. Emily then plays the Switch and it explodes in her face. Okay, so James only made that one contact with California, right? Because he sent the Switch to Emily. So because he only made that one isolated, singular, or random contact with Emily, Emily can only sue him for that one reason. Because not only did he make contacts with California by sending her the gain system, her injury is related to that contact because that switch that he intentionally sent to the state caused her that injury. Therefore, she would have a viable case and she can haul James into court in California. So with fair play and substantial justice, it boils down to this definition. The court's exercise of PJ over the defendant must not offend the traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice. Okay, so the court will look at a variety of things when they look at fair play and substantial justice, which will be these three things: the burden on the defendant, whether the burden is high or low, the potential witnesses and evidence, and also the state's interest in the case. So let's use the example with Emily and James. Okay, so the state would have a lot of interest in this case, right? Because Emily is a resident of the state of California. Therefore, the California courts would have interest in this case because she is their resident. Moreover, potential witnesses and the evidence of her injuries will be in California. So it would be a high burden to have the case heard elsewhere. So California will be the best bet in that case. Lastly, the burden on the defendant. It wouldn't be that much of a burden on James because all he has to do is simply buy a plane ticket to go from Michigan to California. Then to have all the witnesses and evidence go to Michigan, assuming they want to get it heard in Michigan. So in that case, PJ would be satisfied and James would have to go to California in order to get sued. It's debatable, but I think it would be PJ in that situation. So if you have any questions, let me know.